So hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. But what is closest to us is often as blurry as it is urgent. But by taking the long view of the recent past, perhaps we can bring our world into better focus, both who we are and where we're headed. So today we want to take a look specifically at how the events of the last 25 years have shaped us, how they can help us understand our current moment better, and where we'll go from here. So I couldn't be more delighted to share this stage with this incredible group of people who have lots of New York Times bestseller books and lots of awards. So allow me to kind of start with introductions. Marlon James is the author of numerous New York Times bestsellers. His book, A Brief History of 7 Killings, won the Man Booker Prize, the America Book Award, and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award.
Thank you.
Yeah, amazing.
Thank you.
Next to Marlon is Jared Cohen. He's the founder and CEO of Jigsaw at Alphabet Inc. and a New York Times bestselling author of 4 books, including his latest, Accidental Presidents. From 2006 to 2010, he served 2 Secretary of States, Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. Next up, Lydia Polgreen. Lydia is editor-in-chief of HuffPost. Previously, she spent 15 years at the New York Times. And Lydia was a 2006 recipient of the George Polk Award in recognition of her reporting on the carnage in Darfur. And last, Ronan Farrow is a contributing writer to The New Yorker, where his investigative reporting won him a Pulitzer Prize, among other honors. His latest book, Catch and Kill, chronicles the tactics of powerful men and how they silence their victims of abuse, most notably Harvey Weinstein and Matt Lauer. So, for every generation, there's an event that completely rocks us, whether it's the assassination of JFK, the Challenger explosion, 9/11. It's that event that no matter how much time passes, you could put yourself right back there in front of the TV and re-experience it all over again. In social psychology, we call these flashbulb moments. But I want to sort of start by going down the line, really, in wondering which of the event of the last 25 years has captivated you and why?
Oh God, you're starting with me.
Yes, or we can start with Ronan, but you know.
Well, I can think of two things. Certainly the explosion of social media. One of the things that I've noticed, and it's maybe something we have in common, I was looking at the panel, and I wondered if this panel was if we had this same panel in 1996, would anybody like us be on it? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we would, for all sorts of reasons. But it's social media, and I have a lot of bad things to say about it. But I can think of just the type of author I am and the type of authors I know. Mm-hmm. When I talk to Nigerian authors and Gambian authors and Namibian authors, they're talking about, we weren't a family. Whatever we want to say about Twitter, Chimamanda Adichie couldn't talk to Bingavanga Wainana before Twitter.
Right.
So that kind of international community of writers of color mm-hmm. is something that is something for me that's super, super significant. But another thing that for me probably the most impactful is what happened in Ferguson mm-hmm. and the rise of Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. For some very, very plainly obvious reasons, I live for most of the year, or at least half of the year, in Minnesota, where Philando Castile was murdered, and being the sort of stereotypical big black man. Yeah, I'm a big black man in a dress, but I'm still big black dude, and being in a kind of, I think we're all certainly in this weird kind of paralysis because mm-hmm. we haven't quite figured out yet what's the correct behavior to not get killed. Clearly, it's not watching TV in your apartment, which we thought was one of the acceptable ones, but that got crossed off the list last week. So I think that for me, it's a kind of between something really, really great and something very, very not bad, not great rather. Mm-hmm. In fact, something quite horrendous and terrible. And those two things to me kind of
I'm so
seesaw
sorry that
fence.
has to be an experience in our country.
Yeah,
So,
me too.
Jared?
So Monica, since you asked the question in such a personal way, I'll sort of preface my answer with, in 2004 and 2005, I was living in Iran, and I was doing some research on a book I was writing about the Middle East, and I wasn't at all interested in technology. I was interested specifically in opposition movements and young people in Iran. And when I was there, I saw young people using technology to organize to do things that they weren't allowed to do. There was nothing political about it, but they were using technology I was familiar with in ways that I never could have imagined. And you see that, and it dawned on me as I left the country in a bit of a hurry, that one day the tactics that they were using just to have a good time would have a profound political importance. So this was 2004, 2005. Fast forward to June of 2009. The population in Iran rejects the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, takes to the streets in the largest protests in the country since the revolution in 1979, and it's sort of dubbed the world's first Twitter revolution. Now the irony is this is a year and some change before the Arab Spring, and technology actually had very little to do with how people organized, but the exaggerated sense of its importance meant that it was cast across every single headline in every news outlet that you could imagine. Of course, it fell off the headlines 3 weeks later when Michael Jackson died and more important things came to prominence. But for me, this moment had the most profound impact, not just on how I think about my career, but it was a watershed moment in how we think about international affairs. Because it was the moment where technological trends, particularly around social, were converging with age-old geopolitical trends. And of course, now we accept the fact that the international system has both a physical and digital front and that our world is multidimensional. But it all started right there in the streets of Tehran in June of 2009.
Interesting. Lydia?
I think for me, I would say the most important thing that's happened over the last 25 years is the breakdown of the consensus and around the arrangements of our political economy in global capitalism, and all of the disruption that has created in the world, some of it incredibly exciting, some of it frankly terrifying. And I think like adjacent to that, I would just build on what Marlon was saying, the notion that individuals are now building movements that question things like police violence against unarmed people, or gun violence, as we're seeing with the Parkland kids and other youth activists. Now with the Sunrise Movement, the children organizing around climate change. I feel like there's been this sort of profound breakdown of power structures, and at the heart of it is really a rejection and a skepticism about the overall political and economic power arrangements that have governed our post-war life. And the breakdown of those arrangements, I think, is both is awesome in ways that are both positive and like incredibly scary.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, first of all, before I answer the question, I just want to take a second to acknowledge this panel. These are incredible people. I was so excited to get on stage with them. I personally admire stuff that each of you have done. So thank you to all of you. And I don't know if we can put the graphic of our illustrated selves back up, but if they manage eventually to get that back up, worth a look, and please find yourself someone who looks at you the way illustrated Lydia Paulgreen looks at illustrated me. I think the question was, what's the most important or captivating moment? And I would take it in a slightly different direction. I'm not an historian, and there's a lot of campfire answers I could give casually, but I think probably the question that I meditate on more often is, what is the moment or set of moments that have most directly affected and empowered the work that I've done, which is probably the only subset of that I know intimately. And the reporting that we've seen in recent years, what often is called broadly, Me Too reporting, but I think actually is a much broader swath of reporting that empowers the voices of marginalized people, particularly survivors of sexual violence. And as a significant subset of that, reporting that listens to women in a way that the press didn't before. That has been a hugely significant shift in media. And it's not a single moment. Obviously, it's rooted in many decades of feminism and activism and transformations in the media. But I think building off of a number of points several of you made, part of the kind of democratization of media platforms, the access to social media, the lower barriers of entry for people's voices being heard, is also that those in power who controlled the narrative have less of a vice grip on it. And there is much more ability for people to defy the considerable systems that are in place to prevent those marginalized voices from being heard and to finally speak. And activists use phrases like believe all survivors, believe all women, and I'm on the journalism end of the spectrum, not the activism end, and therefore that's much less my philosophy. I think we need to be skeptical of all claims of that type. But I do think that for too long our culture not only wasn't believing, but simply wasn't listening. And I do think that it is a profoundly journalistic ethos to say, listen to all women, listen to all survivors.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that the greatest service we can do as journalists in our profession is to rigorously interrogate those claims as we listen to them. Right. And we are finally doing that. Not enough, and there are still cases where people are being silenced in a whole variety of ways, which is the subject of a new book called Catch and Kill that you just heard about.
Well,
we have someone in the audience who read Catch and Kill.
I'm sure many.
Yes.
I'm sure many.
Thank you for that.
Right.
But yes, that to me feels like a profound change that we're
Right.
still in the midst of.
Yeah. Well, I think even though I'm moderator, I should probably answer this question too. I'm just
should.
obviously.
Of course.
No, I was joking. It's a joke. What do you think the most profound historical moment was for me of the last 25 years?
She's talking about Brexit.
Exactly. Exactly. So, I don't know about everyone else, but it does feel like the news cycle is not only moving faster than ever, but it's moving on faster than ever too. And major events seem to sort of fade away in a matter of days, right? It's like climate tragedies, mass shootings, Trump tweets. If anybody can believe this, the Mueller report came out only 6 months ago. Yeah. So over the last few decades, we've gone from being a Cronkite era to the 24-hour news cycle, to news notifications on our home screens, and now to second by second on Twitter. So I kind of wanted to start with you, Lydia, as editor-in-chief. You must, of course, think about what's going to get people's attention. What are the things that we should be paying attention to and caring about? So I guess more specifically is, how do we determine what is worth paying attention to, and how do we avoid burnout?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's essentially impossible to avoid burnout. But it's funny, when I was thinking about this question, which you helpfully sent to me in advance, so I could study up and think about it.
Not the exact question, but the topic.
How not specifically that question, but, even having had time to think about it. But it's funny, I mean, like everyone, I feel like I'm constantly drinking from the fire hose of new developments, and yet, like, the things that break through, I know, are the things that truly matter. When I first got the push alert about the Harvey Weinstein story in the New York Times, or when Ronan's first piece dropped, like, you saw that, like, and in just a few sentences, had a clear sense that, like, that the world was shifting on its axis, Mm-hmm. And it's our job as journalists and particularly as editors, whose role it is to sort of curate and frame for you, like, this is a moment when you should really be paying attention, to say, yeah, this is a moment when the world is fundamentally changing from one thing to another. Mm-hmm. So there are moments like that where it feels really, really clear. And then there are other moments where it feels so much less clear, right? I mean, I think for us as journalists, we felt like Charlottesville was a moment when the world had tilted on its axis. And it was like, okay, now finally we're going to have a different kind of conversation. Mm-hmm. And over the past couple of weeks, as the Ukraine story has unfolded, on the one hand, I think it's, oh my God, like, it is a quid pro quo. This is an impeachable offense. Impeachment is starting. This is happening. And then there's a part of your brain that thinks, wait, is this kind of like the Access Hollywood tape? Like, remember when the Access Hollywood tape came out and everybody thought, this is it, Trump is gonna have to drop out. And all of the stories that came out around it were, he's going to, Mike Pence is gonna become the nominee, and there's all this behind the scenes shenanigans going on to try and figure out how to deal with it. And yet somehow he was able to brazen it out. And so I think there are certain kinds of events where on an almost molecular level, you have a sense that this changes everything. And for everything else, it feels like we're just sort of swimming in this sea of, have we been here before? Do we know what this is like? Are we in completely uncharted territory? And the other thing that we really struggle with in the news is, ultimately, news is about what's new. So powerful men being brought low for mistreating women, like, holy shit, that's new. Like, that is not something that has happened before.
Some to the degree, I think, and also, I think maybe where people would have been called out in certain ways, as you said, the door would get shut, right? And I think that's something that we've seen, which has been different too.
But I think in politics, it has been the sort of the pot in the boiling, the pot in the frog in the boiling pot, right? Mm-hmm. It's a little bit more coarseness, a little bit more a little further stepping over the norms. And we've slowly become inured and accustomed to a certain level of acceptance with this presidency.
And I want to encourage too that, I want to encourage all the panelists.
Well, I mean, it's funny because I was
jump in and I get to interrupt people too, which is really exciting.
Because Ronan and I were talking about this backstage, and the book before the current book. What's it called again? The book
War
that you have?
on
No,
Peace.
Your current book.
Catch and Kill.
Got to keep his publicist happy. But before,
Thank you for that plug.
Before his current book, Ronan had an excellent book about essentially the decline of American diplomacy. And what's remarkable to me is I remember reading this book and thinking, oh, this is a really great, very well researched. It had lots of scoops in it, huge insider access. You and Jared, this is your world. You could talk about it for hours. And then over the last, as this testimony is happening and you're seeing these diplomats come forward and testifying, I was like, oh wait, that book really mattered. Like the stuff that you're talking about, the decline of American democracy of American diplomacy isn't oh geez, that's too bad kind of thing. It's oh geez, this is a fundamental peril to the Republic.
I obviously would be inclined to agree, since I wrote a book title that said that was the case. That book, like the later investigative reporting that I did that I was referring to before, was fueled by brave whistleblowers who came forward and talked about what I think Lydia is right, is a profound and fundamental problem that now afflicts America's place in the world, which is we have deprofessionalized and strip-mined our diplomatic enterprise, and therefore there is no one at the helm or in an oversight role making sure that there aren't shady deals being promised on calls with the president.
Right.
You need records being kept and people on the line and diplomats who are empowered enough to steer these conversations to a professional place and hold them to a professional standard. And as Lydia says, that is not incidental. That is the challenge we face in so many different interactions we have with the wider world. And a sub-point in what I just said is part of my answer to your first question about burnout. That book about the destruction of the State Department, Catch and Kill, we're going to see how many times we can do it, take a shot every time you get the title, is also a book that is not just about crimes and cover-ups, it is about the bravery of whistleblowers and the fact that they keep coming forward even in the face of smear campaigns and a media that sometimes isn't yet ready to hear her truth. And I don't see any sign of that stopping. And so even when I write about really dark things, I try to make prominent in it the thread of hope.
Right.
Because I think that that is very much alive and well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because as you sort of mention, you know, a whistleblower, that they kind of come in after the fact of something having gone wrong, obviously. And Jared, you spend a lot of time being an expert really at blind spotting. And so I sort of wanted to pose a question specifically to you around which historical moments or moment, you know, from the past 25 years that you see, that you think as a society, we haven't spent enough time analyzing.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I answer that, though, I think one of the things, Ronan, that you've done is in that same time period, you look at Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, and the idea of whistleblowing was controversial, it was contentious, it was polarizing, and I think the work that you've done is you've resurrected the dignity around whistleblowing, and I think we all owe you a debt of gratitude for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to the whistleblowers themselves. I
Yes.
mean, thank God, I couldn't tell any of these stories without the bravery of sources. And you know, that ultimately is part of the story of this moment in history, that whistleblowers are, I think, you're very kind to say that my work is part of this, but I think as part of a much wider conversation, are once again correctly being elevated, and we are all being reminded as a culture that our laws protect the practice of whistleblowing and protect conscientious objectors to things who come forward to dismantle wrongdoing from the inside for a reason.
Well, maybe I can answer, Monica, your question and tie it back to whistleblowing, because if you think about the last 25 years, which is the scope of this panel, we begin this 25-year period with a genocide in Rwanda in 1994. 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus killed in 100 days, the most efficient killing of any group of people in the 20th century, largely done with machetes and boards with nails in them. And then 25 years later, this period is bookended by the fate of the Kurds essentially being handed over to Bashar al-Assad, the Russians, and Erdogan in Turkey. And that's before you get into everything in between, Darfur, which Lydia knows well, the Yazidis in Iraq, the Balkans, the Rohingya, et cetera. And so to me, we have failed to appreciate the meaning of the words never again and always remember, and we still focus on post-conflict as opposed to focusing on pre-conflict. So to tie this to the previous thread, maybe the real investment in whistleblowing should be investment in encouraging the types of voices who can help us with pre-conflict to come alive so that we can prevent some of these humanitarian nightmares before they happen, so that we don't once again say never again, and yes, we've learned our lesson, or this is going to happen again, and we'll deal with it differently next time. We need to empower the voices who can help us spot these things before they happen.
And do you, I mean, this is sort of a follow-up to everybody, just kind of what's being said about if our relationship to history making, if that has desensitized us in some ways. So do you think that that's like does that make sense? No, I can reframe it. I mean, I can look at my notes where I wrote down questions. Do we think humanity's relationship to history making events is changing? Are we becoming desensitized or less empathetic?
I mean, I would come back to what Marlon was saying, which is like, that we're seeing these movements that are building around, individuals who are themselves saying never again, right? Who themselves are at great personal risk, whether they're whistleblowers or they're activists, going out into the streets and saying like, we will not tolerate this.
Yeah, I wonder because I teach undergrads. I'm teaching kids from 17 up, and it's funny. The first time I taught a first-year course was the year of the Obama election, and I remember that generation, those kids, and they're like, "Oh my God, I voted for a president I liked, and he became president. Oh my God!" And they were just so excited. And fast forward to 2016, where I had to conduct a funeral wake in my class, and they were so, because it hit them in a very personal way. I think one of the differences between, say, the 2016 election and, say, the war in Iraq is that for a lot of people don't know anybody involved in Iraq. Right. It's not like Vietnam, so you can opt out. It doesn't matter who you were. You couldn't really opt out of Vietnam. You could opt out of Iraq. But what some of my kids came across were things where grandma voted for Trump. And I have, Friendsgiving is a big thing now because a lot of my students have not been home for Thanksgiving in 3 years.
Wow.
Because they can't.
Right. Sure, of course.
Yeah, because
family dynamic.
the family dynamic,
Right.
I mean, just serrated in two because of the past few years. So what you find, certainly with that generation, is that they're not desensitized at all. If anything, they look at my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, and go, how did you get desensitized? And I'm like, I'm not sure. So I think, I do think there is a level of involvement. When you talk about, I can't pronounce Greta's surname.
Oh, Thunberg.
Thunberg. And she's not the only one. And that's the way in which this generation who are very active, also very, very, shockingly uncynical.
Yeah.
Because I was very proud of being super clever. Cleverness didn't get me shit, but I was very proud of
Right.
And whereas I do think that that cleverness sort of resulted in a kind of certain inaction.
Yes.
Which I don't see with them. So I don't know. I don't think. I think also their relationship to say social media and so on is just so different, and I think that they feel empowered in a way that I know when I was their age I just didn't. When I was their age, I'm like, come on, nuclear war is gonna kill all of us anyway. Yeah.
I mean, I think that there is there's something remarkable about the extent to which the generation that was born and came up in the past 25 years has skin in the game in a way that the rest of us kind of don't. I'm a Gen Xer, you're a millennial. Older millennial.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You're a millennial.
Jared's a millennial.
81 right on.
Okay, you're right on the
Z? Are you Z or millennial?
Okay.
What's 81?
Thank you.
It just bothers me
You're a
because you're so
millennial.
accomplished for being a
I'm
millennial.
in denial about that.
But think about it this way, right? Like those of us who are Gen Xers, we're the last generation that has a better than 50% chance of out-earning our parents, right? Like we entered life with less debt, less student debt, with better career prospects. I mean, if you're a young person whose career started, professional post-college career started in the aftermath of the housing crisis, you're like 10 years behind. It's crazy, right? Yeah. So I feel like young people today, they just have a different level of, they just have a lot on the line in terms of what the future holds for them and where they're gonna go, and also what they're willing to give up, right? Because they just have less at stake, you know? They're not gonna inherit something that's good, that's exciting. They're not looking at the current arrangements and saying, oh yeah, I'm just gonna find my perch in this and then worm my way up. They're saying like, this is bullshit. You know, this doesn't work for anybody. And so, like, let's change it.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of self-determination. You know, again, my students grow up now looking at HIV as a chronic condition, as opposed to a death sentence. As a big flipping deal. You know, and just the way in which they've responded to queerness, transgender, so on. You know, we still have this argument, certainly Gen X are trans women. You know, I call them post-millennials, they're like, duh.
Yeah.
Can we move on? And I was in Jamaica, and I was meeting this Gay Students Association, and I came with my "It Gets Better" speech. I was ready, and I started, and they're like, "We don't want to hear that shit. Do you know Beyonce?" And it hit me. I said, "Oh my God, we're about to deal with a bunch of queer kids who get to just focus on being a kid." Or worrying about teenage shit, you know, worrying about, well, is it Taylor versus Katy Perry, as you should, because that is a matter of life-changing consequence. I'm not even being ironic.
And they finally brokered a truce.
Yeah.
So there's some hope in our dark
Yeah, but that's why I think they're not cynical.
Right.
Because even in the age of climate catastrophe and so on, they've grown up in an era of some really great possibilities. And I think that in some ways have empowered them.
Right. Did you want to add to that?
One of the things I worry about, though, is you sort of do the 1600s versus the 2019 example, which is you'd much rather have visibility into all the world's problems today than visibility into all the world's problems in 1600, right? So the problem is, today's young people, they're bombarded with problems and chaos, and it's hard to keep up with it. The tension between more awareness and more superficial engagement with those problems is something that I worry about. That young people are bringing an influencer strategy to how they engage in the world's problems, and their engagement is shallower, and we sort of hope it gets deeper over time, but what happens when it doesn't?
Right. Well, I think you guys sort of teed up this perfect, what I think is our last question, kind of a rapid fire around the future. I know, sorry. Around, so it's 25 years in the future. Year is 2044. We have a microchip in our brains, which is how we view the news and get our information. What are we paying attention to? Anybody?
I don't know. I don't know. Impeachment hearings against President Ivanka Trump? I don't know. One thing, I think though that as somebody who writes fictions and also writes lots of sort of fantasy and fantastical fictions, I think that the whole notion of storytelling is going to change and is changing. And I think that I can't wait for us to get to the point where we take certain things for granted. That we take a brown girl coming of age narrative for granted.
Or there won't be coming out anymore. The notion of coming out
right.
won't be a thing.
And I actually do think that is something that will happen. I actually, as somebody who is occasionally an activist, nothing would give me joy more than my own irrelevance. That I don't want to be fighting over this shit in 20 years. I want to hear people like, do you remember when we used to fight over that? And that's the thing. I am so committed to my eventual irrelevance. That would be good joy for me.
I'll join you.
Yeah.
Anybody else have other?
I think we're inevitably headed for a confrontation around our what I would call our political economy. I think that our current setup is not working for enough people, and inequality is a time bomb, and it is a time bomb that's set at different times in different places around the world, because it's a problem with different kinds of dimensions. I mean, when I was a foreign correspondent, the time bomb that's ticking in South Africa, where I was a correspondent for, just in the 2 years before Nelson Mandela died, that time bomb is ticking at a much faster rate, I think, than the one that's ticking here in this country, even though things here feel like they're happening really quickly and in a very scary way. I just think that we're gonna be in a world where the way that we organize ourselves as humanity and the way that we relate to one another politically and economically is going to be fundamentally different, because the current setup will not hold.
There's an American inventor named Charles Kettering who said we should all be concerned about the future because we're going to have to spend the rest of our lives there. But he also said that in order to understand where we're going, we need to understand where we came from to figure out that trajectory. And if you look at the signals today, and where there's the greatest ambiguity and where we seem completely stumped about how to navigate the future, it's entirely around the myriad cyber clashes that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, which were not part of the zeitgeist 5 to 7 years ago. And I think in the next 25 years, we're going to somewhere in the world see the real consequences of a significant cyber war. And I think that's going to be significant, one, because it hasn't really happened yet, and two, we have a hard time even imagining what that would look like and what we would do about it.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is slightly off topic, but I spent a lot of time thinking about how, because we're becoming a society of spectrums, that I think just in a very narrow way, as we look back on history, even historical data that we collected, like it won't be accurate. You know, we won't, because people had to identify as one or two different genders or sexuality and all of those things. And so I wonder how that will start to inform how we look at history in a way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it's like Y2K, but for identity.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Leave it to the editor-in-chief to make it clever. I want to thank the panelists so much. This was really interesting, especially as somebody who's had a different relationship to history. I appreciated getting to be a moderator here and learning from all of you today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.